Maybe I should have actually started this video by saying that there are no gardening mistakes, only learning. Hi everyone! Today we'll talk about some basics to make sure you have success whatever you add to your gardens. So we'll talk about the light requirements, the soils, the watering, spacing, and all of those things that you need to get right in order to get the best success with your plants. Let's get started! Possibly when you start gardening, one of the most tempting things to do is to go right at the garden center, grab a few things that are blooming, and then consider your border done. Well, that will work really well for just a couple of weeks, but of course if you choose plants that all bloom together, you will have a very limited time of interest in your garden. So another thing that I would say to consider really carefully when you're planting your garden is to plant for year-round interest. Even though we spend a lot of time in our gardens, of course, I would say at peak season, especially in the UK, in the summer, there are still things that you can do to make this space really pretty to look at, even in other seasons. You might have heard the phrase, evergreens or trees and shrubs are the backbone of a garden, and that is true. And this is typically also the kind of plants that are recommended to plant first, so that you always have a really strong structure and interest in your garden. Another way to bring interest in your garden is through artscaping. So adding decorative elements, rocks, pergolas, structures, garden art, decor, anything that still can catch your eye in the winter time. Regardless of how large your garden is, it's always a good idea to consider a plant that will give you several seasons of interest. So for example, a tree that would flower and then produce some berries, and then a foliage that changes color in autumn. This way, you have 3 seasons of interest out of a plant, and that's really amazing. Also, you can make that 4 if you choose a tree that has a really lovely bark, like a maple or a birch tree, for example. For example, in my small garden, I have several evergreen shrubs. I have a spruce tree, I have a camellia, I have some cedar and boxes topiaries. So really beautiful plants that are pretty all year round, and that helps me create seasonal displays. Another way to do that is to also add plants in your borders for their foliage, not only their bloom. So things like lamb's ear or sedum, or any plants that has really beautiful foliage, hookgrass or astas, and that's still lush and beautiful for a really long time, much longer than perennial flush of blooms would give you. Another way to do that is also by adding lighting to the garden. That really makes plants shine in the evening and can also create a very cozy atmosphere regardless of the season. So don't only rely on flowers. Use textures, use evergreens and decor to bring year-round interest in the garden. One of the key things to know about your garden is where the sun is, because of course this is one of the main requirements for your plants to be happy. So if you're purchasing a plant that loves sunlight, you need to know that so that you can give it the best growing conditions for success. Sunlight requirements for plants are typically divided into 3 categories. Full sun plants that require over 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. Plants that require part shade or part sun. This is between 4 to 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. And finally, full shade, which are your shade lovers that typically require less than 4 hours of direct sunlight a day. This information is usually available on the plant tag, of course, or you can always research the specific variety that you're purchasing, and that's always something that I would recommend so you know exactly where to place it in your garden. So it's really important to, in your own space, be aware of where the sun is and at what time of day. For example, my garden is west facing, so in the decking just next to the house, I have a full sun area in the afternoon, and then a strip of morning sun on the opposite edge, and then the bed on the left-hand side of the garden is full shade. Knowing that helps me know exactly where what type of plants should go where. So I have a more shaded area of the garden with astas and euchras and ferns and shade lovers in general, and the decking is for sun lovers. To do that in your own garden, you simply have to look at what the sun does and where it is at several times of day. Also, just be aware of fences or buildings or any kind of structure, because of course they will cast shade, so you have to take that into account as well. For trees, that's the same, and you may have an area that varies between winter and summer, because of course the sun doesn't go as high in the winter, And also a leaf canopy, for example, for deciduous trees would change, where in early spring the trees might not be leafed out completely yet. Under you would have some sun, so good space for spring bulbs. But then when you carry on throughout the season, in the summer when your tree is fully leafed out, you have a really big shade area. So you'd have to put plants there that would tolerate a more shady location. Another example where it would be really important is when you add climbers. So for example, in my garden, this plant was here when we moved in, and it's a really big established bush of honeysuckle, and it's in the shaded area of the garden. We have this bare bottom situation where the entire bottom panel of the fence that it's supposed to cover is bare, and all the growth is at the top and the blooms are at the top where they can get some sun. And this might happen also if you have a north facing fence, for example, and you want to put a climber there. Your neighbor might enjoy all the blooms because they will go towards the sun. So always something to be mindful of. In spring and autumn, for example, where the sun is not so harsh, you may be okay by fudging a little bit those guidelines. For example, I did a window box in a full sun location with an hellebore, which typically wouldn't be able to handle so much sun, but because it was the spring and the sunlight was not so harsh, it was okay. So again, a guideline, but when you start your garden, it's much easier to follow those simple rules to get success. Watering can make or break your garden because, of course, it's another essential growing condition for your plants to perform well. So there are two types of dangers when it comes to watering. Underwatering, which means the plant is water stressed, it's not getting enough water, so you can see some dieback on the plants, for example, some browning, and could potentially succumb to pest pressure. Water is not only important for flowering, but for any kind of fruit production. If you don't give enough water to your plants, to your vegetables, they're not going to produce crop or to produce bloom for you. So that is really important to get right. But on the other end of the scale, if you overwater your plants, you can kill them by rot. A plant that shows signs of overwatering would have some yellowing on the leaves and also some brown spots also potentially. That can happen a lot with seedlings, for example, if you don't allow the soil to dry out ever so slightly in between waterings. For containers, one way to check is to use the very scientific method of the finger test. So you just stick your finger in the pot and check the dryness level of the top inches of soil. If it's still moist, you don't have to water. If it's dry, check a bit deeper, and if it's still dry, then you need to water again. So the watering schedule is always a question that gets asked quite a lot, but of course it depends on your growing conditions, of the weather. If it's extra windy, for example, your plants might need more water. If you're growing in containers in afternoon sun like me in the decking, you might even have to water every few days. It really depends. Mulching is always recommended to help retain moisture in the soil, both in containers and in borders. It also helps with weed control, so I would definitely encourage you to mulch your garden beds. When my rainwater supply runs out, which in the summer happens quite quickly, I do use tap water. Watering can become quite an intensive task, so it's always good to pick the right plants for the right area. For example, I've created quite a lot of maintenance for myself. As I've mentioned several times, I'm growing a lot of plants in containers, and here the decking where I'm right now is full sun in the afternoon, and I'm growing a lot of plants that are pretty water hungry. So for example, I had 2 hydrangeas there that died because I could just not keep up with watering them enough. If you're growing in containers like me, to reduce the watering chores, it's always better to pick containers that are as large as possible because of course they'll be able to retain more moisture and will make therefore the watering less frequent. Another really important thing to consider when adding plants to your garden is your soil type. There are typically 6 major types of soils that you can get. Those are clay, sand, loam, silt, chalk, and peat. A full peaty soil is rare in a garden, but that can happen. In my garden, for example, I have a clay soil. That is a really heavy soil that gets waterlogged in winter and completely baked dry in the summer. A sandy soil is really light typically and low in nutrients, and also warms up quicker in spring. Silt is also pretty rare in gardens. You typically have to run a couple of tests to find that out. And loam would be a balance of all those other soil types. So I guess the perfect soil because you have a good balance of drainage, of water retention, but also of nutrients. But fear not, if you have sand or clay soil, for example, or a chalky soil, you can always amend with organic matter, and over the years that will help improve your soil structure. Clay has this problem that it's a rich soil, but the nutrients are trapped, so you still need to add this organic matter to help break up those big lumps of soil. Also, chalky soils are alkaline. That means they have a pH that's over 7, and again, that is only suited to some type of plants. On the opposite scale are more acidic soils, of course, and those are more suited to ericaceous plants, things like camellias, for example, or blueberries that thrive a lot more in acidic soils. You could always grow some plants in containers, for example, where you'd be able to better control the soil mix that you use. So knowing what type of soil you have in your garden is important, because different types of plants will do best in different types of soils. Especially if you grow in containers, there might not be enough nutrients in the soil to ensure that your plants stay happy. So it's always a good idea to add fertilizer on an annual basis, and sometimes several times a year, so that your plants stay happy and perform their best. Typically, a general purpose fertilizer works well, but you can also purchase specific fertilizer for a specific group of plants, like roses, like evergreens, ericaceous plants. There's a lot of different things out there. If you're just getting started, buy a good pelletized long life fertilizer, apply in early spring and in the middle of the summer, and you should be fine. Especially if you have a large garden, you might have different types of soils in different areas of your garden, so it's a good idea to assess each individual area when you want to add plants. There are a lot of soil kits or soil testers out there. I've never personally tried, but you can get your pH soil tested and send soil samples so that you know exactly what's in it and what kind of amendments you should be doing. But of course, you also have your plant heroes that do well regardless of the type of soil, so that's also always good to include some of those, as you know that they will perform really well. Spacing is another really important key of garden planning. Plants have a mature size that can be reached within a matter of weeks or months when we talk about annuals that complete their life cycle in one season, or for example for trees, this might take decades. But you still have to be aware of that when you add plants in your garden. If you plant your plants too close together, of course, that will prevent them from growing to their full potential, introduce a lot of competition, and also more maintenance for you, as you'd have probably to do more pruning, or even in the long term, you might have to move some plants around. When you introduce a specific plant, it's always good to research that specific variety, because even within a genus of plant, you can have wildly different varieties, and they don't all grow to the same size, or even don't all have exactly the same requirements. So of course, when you're designing your landscape, you have the choice of buying smaller plants that will take several years to mature to their full size, or get them directly, in their mature size or in a bigger size. This of course will cost more money, so that's always a trade-off between cost when you buy and time. When you create seasonal displays or seasonal bedding, you may want to plant closer together so that you have a really full effect, but of course that would be for temporary planting. And if you were using perennials, for example, in a group of plants, you would want to then relocate it in the landscape where it would have enough room to grow to its mature size. And it's something you can see a lot typically with evergreens, that when you buy sometimes evergreens at the garden centers, they can come in a very small size, but several years later you can notice that the plants are starting to grow in between each other and are getting stressed, are getting misshapen because they have not been spaced properly. One of the last things I wanted to say is that to be a real gardener, you don't have to grow everything from seed. Especially at this time of year, we see a lot of videos about what to sow from seed, what to grow from seed, something that you have to do every month, and really, you don't have to do that. Maybe I should have actually started this video by saying that there are no gardening mistakes, only learning, but it's another thing to throw out there, that it's okay to fail and to learn by trial and error. This is how we learn best in the garden, especially. So just try it, and if it doesn't work, that's fine. You'll try something else again. We don't always have to have perfect success. There are still a lot of things that never grow properly or just completely fail, so it's okay. Everybody has that, and it's fine. I hope this video was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!